Kentucky and Southern Indiana, a member council of the World Affairs Councils of America, which is the largest grassroots organization in the country dedicated to educating the public on global affairs. We trace our origins to 1918 and the birth of the Foreign Policy Association, which is a member council. So, here we are. Fred is making his way up. I'd like to thank the Tim Faulkner Gallery for having us, for hosting us in this space. Normally we do these events at the Kentucky Center, University Club at the U of L, and other spots, but we thought this would be a special venue for this particular event. Fred joins a list of speakers such as Mikhail Gorbachev, Colin Powell, Christine Amanpour, John Scully, Malcolm Nance, numerous academics, ambassadors, and diplomats to speak for the World Affairs Council here in Kentucky and Southern Indiana. Several programs, education programs, speaker series, and international exchanges help us reach the public and tell them a little bit about international affairs and open their eyes to the world. I'd like to bring up our Vice Chair of our Board of Directors, U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Rob Givens. He's retired, and he will lead us into this tonight's event. So thank you very much for coming, and let's get this started.
Boy, I haven't been under these type of spotlights since resistance training many years ago as a cadet. Good evening, welcome to the Faulkner Gallery. I think we can all agree what a great venue to talk a little bit. And that's exactly what we're going to do tonight. The ability for humans to communicate is difficult enough of a process. We speak different languages. We have different meanings for words. Those who can communicate and communicate effectively are gifted. Those who can go further and communicate emotion and shared experience are extremely gifted. And we are very honored tonight to have someone who has done just that. Colonel Fred Johnson, United States Army retired, originally from Centralia, Illinois, spent 29 and a half years defending our country and his interests, and often at great sacrifice, professionally and personally. But Fred has been able to take his experience and share it with us in the written word. And those of us in the audience who are veterans can identify with all of those emotions: the thrill of combat, the fear of combat, the moral dilemma of combat, the humor at times of combat, but also with the stress that comes. And for those of our generation of military members, it has been a very, very long series of wars, as Fred is so aptly titled in his book. So I hope that those of you who are in the audience who've ever said thank you for your service will take a moment and repay that service by opening your minds and opening your ears and trying to understand a little bit more about what that service has meant, and more importantly, what it has cost. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred Johnson. Thank you very much for coming out. I want to say a couple words of introduction, and the first thing I'm going to say, I want to thank the World Affairs Council for hosting this event and sponsoring it. If you don't know about the World Affairs Council, I would ask that you go out and learn a little bit, because I think they have one of the most important missions in this of any organization in this city. Now, I'm a member, so I'm a little bit biased, but I'll tell you why. It's the World Affairs Council. It gives us a worldview, a perspective that helps inform the population, inform the citizenry of this republic, so they can have a dialogue with our leaders. See, a lot of times leaders say, hey, let's put boots on the ground. Well, I'll tell you, there are souls in those boots. And what the World Affairs Council does is allow us that perspective, so when our leaders say, I want to put a soldier in harm's way, that we're informed and we can make that decision. So please join me in a round of applause for the World Affairs Council. Thank you very much.
also want to thank the Tim Faulkner's Gallery. Tim, you're over there tending bar. The choice of this location was intentional, and here's why. Tim used to have his gallery in the safe confines of Nulu, which is on the east side of Louisville. But he chose to take his gallery and bring it in to West Louisville, to Portland, because this is where we need economic development. He didn't have to do that. Tim exhibited soldiers' courage. Courage that soldiers put themselves in a place between combatants and those that are being oppressed, and you make a difference, and that's what Tim has done. Now, I'll tell you, for those who are not from Louisville, that we just recently had a tragedy where there was a shooting here and a young college student from U of L was killed. Now, a lot of businesses would have said, hey, I'm done, I'm out of here. But not Tim Faulkner. Not Tim Faulkner's gallery. And that's something we need to emulate in the city. And we've got other folks in here that do the same thing. Karen Nichols from 1619 Flux. So many others that are saying, no more, we're going to make our city better. Thank you all for that. And thank you, Tim, for what you've done. And finally, I want to thank those of you in the audience, because you're a part of this story, whether literally in the written word or there in spirit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I move forward. But again, thank you for helping me tell my story, but more importantly, being a part of it. Now, if I was to say one sentence about what is Five Wars about, it's very simple. I went to war 4 times. I went to Desert Storm in 1991, Bosnia in 1996, back to Iraq in 2006, and then to Afghanistan in 2011. However, it was my 5th war, my most dangerous war, the one that nearly killed me, was my 5th war here at home. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Now, within the context of that description, there are 3 overarching, intertwined, and interconnected themes that I want to talk about. The first is the power of relationships. The second is the cost of war. And the third is how do veterans who suffer the internal and invisible wounds of war get better. And you'll see, I hope, by reading my book and listening tonight, how those are all 3 interconnected. Relationships. I was on the corner of the most dangerous part of Baghdad, in Dora, Baghdad. And I was there with Jared Knapp, who was Sergeant Knapp, and his job. He had the unenviable job of keeping me alive, which was driving him crazy because it's a very difficult job. And I was there with David Abichelik, who was my interpreter and translator. All of a sudden, we started to hear fire. Pop, 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 pop. And we saw dust, popping off the ground. And then we looked, we couldn't find cover, we couldn't see where the fire was coming from, so we did what every good soldier would do. We ran like hell. So we started running, and the bullets were following us. And they were getting closer and closer. And I was in front, Knapp was in the middle, and Abichelik was at the end. It was something like Looney Tunes. So we were moving along, the bullets are trying to catch us, and we saw a gape in the wall. And as we got there, Knapp pushed me in, he pulled in Abichelik, and we tumbled head over feet. And when we finally got our bearings, I felt something running down the back of my neck. Abichelik came up from under my legs. He had something running out of his mouth. And Knapp was looking for his wounds. He didn't have any, but then we noticed there were 30 sets of eyes looking at us, and they had surrounded us. And all of a sudden, one of those sets of eyes goes, bah, bah. We had landed in a pile of goat shit in a cow pasture. And so we're looking at each other, and we start laughing, and we can't stop laughing until the very end. So in that about 5-minute period, you go from intense fear all the way down to absurdity and hilarity in that little moment of time. And that is the experience of war. And that's, in the hardship of war, you build those relationships and you build that camaraderie through that shared hardship. I want to tell another story about another soldier, and I'm actually going to read from my book, from one of the chapters. It was 2007, at the height of the surge in Iraq. Command Sergeant Major Julie Walter signaled me from the doorway of the food ministry in Baghdad's Sadr city. It was August. Sergeant Major Walter's uniform was soaked. Perspiration dripped from her nose, ears, and chin. Her body armor and neck guard were stained from the combination of sweat and Iraq's dust and grit. You could barely discern the digital camouflage pattern on her uniform. Her vehicle, which was just outside the ministry, had just been attacked by grenades. I was in the middle of a pretty tense situation myself. Security guards had surrounded our small team. They were intent on kicking us out of the ministry before we could finish our mission. I broke free and met her at the door. Command Sergeant Major Walter had her M4 at the low ready, a non-threatening posture, and oriented the muzzle of the weapon at the ground, but it was held in such a way she could quickly raise it and engage the target. She stepped into the building, nodded over to the angry security guards, and said, "Why are they being dickheads?" I told her they were just trying to flex and intimidate us. I changed the subject and asked, "What's the status outside with the soldiers in the vehicle?" The grenades landed outside the vehicle, shook some folks up, but everyone is okay. No worries, she said. Julie Walter was from Portland, Oregon, and had joined the Army right out of high school. She had the high cheekbones that would make you think she was a Native American if you were not for her skin tone, which reflected more Irish stock than anything else. If we were not soldiers, and particularly close teammates, I think I would consider her pretty. I'd never given that a thought, though. Regardless, I could imagine that her ancestors were a part of a wagon trains that crossed America and settled the West. Julie had the strength that came from a bloodline of survivors. There was no one that I trusted more. Command Sergeant Major Walters lifted her shoulders to adjust the weight of her body armor and looked over to the security guards. She paused for a second and quickly licked her lips to solve the deep cracks from Iraq's sun. She said, "All right now, sir. Finish up with the frat boys over there and get the food so we can get the heck back to Bakuba." I hesitated, and before I could speak, she said, "I got everything under control outside. The soldiers will be just fine." She then opened the door, stepped out into the oppressive heat, and the soldiers that awaited her leadership. Now, when I said that I was going to tell a story about a soldier, I bet most of you immediately thought that I was going to talk about a male. Well, the fact is, as we talk about our how we fight wars, and people say, well, we can't have women on the front lines fighting our wars. Well, you know what? They're already there, y'all. And it's not only the women that fight. It's the Army is a inclusive, diverse organization, probably the most diverse organization in the world. And you know what? In the time that I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, a third of this book is about Muslims. I served in Iraq and I served in Afghanistan. I spent a good amount of time dealing and working with people of different cultures. Whether it was Mayor Abdullah in Bakuba when we tried to bring food from this story back from Sadr City because Al-Qaeda was starving them. Or whether it was Ahmed Hussein, who I almost shot twice, but ended up helping us through that mission. Or General Karimi of the Afghan Army. Or Suja, who was in the Afghan Army and saved my life, at least on one occasion. So when we think about relationships, and we think about them in the Army, it goes well beyond just those safe confines of what we normally consider. Now, the one thing about relationships, and it's kind of like what Churchill said, is that there's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at with no effect. Well, that may be true until someone dies, particularly someone close to you. I'm going to read the prologue to my book to kind of put this all in context. I finished my beer and thought, where is the best point of departure? I was sitting at a bar on the outdoor deck of my favorite hangout in Jeffersonville, Indiana. The 11th anniversary of 9/11 had been the day before, and I had come there to think, reflect on the war, lost friends, and other things. It was warm and I wore shorts and a t-shirt. As I looked across the Ohio River to the city of Louisville, Kentucky, nightfall had come and brought with it brilliant illumination of the downtown skyline. The purple and yellow lights of the 2nd Street Bridge that connected the two cities merged into a rainbow's array of colors from the office buildings, hotels, and restaurants of Derby City. Louisville was small compared to places like New York or Chicago. However, the urban glow made it appear enormous and bustling. I often got lost in the panorama of the infrastructure's neon peaks, which oddly reminded me of the view I had in Kabul, the Hindu Kush, and the mountains of Afghanistan. I had identified two options in Jeffersonville for which I could depart a world that had become too difficult to bear. I'd come to Jeffersonville that night to kill myself. And how I got to that point and what happened to me afterwards is really the focus of this book. And how I got there was this. When I was in Iraq, we were getting ready to conduct a raid on an area, a neighborhood. And part of that is clearing the road of garbage, because the enemy liked to put garbage in, IEDs in the garbage. So the company commander, who was responsible for the mission, Chris Jones, said, "Hey, sir, I don't feel very good about this. We haven't had enough time. I need some more intel." And I said, "No, brother, got to roll. We got to do this mission tonight." So he left, and they went to Amaria, which was the neighborhood. And as they began their mission, Sergeant Freeman Gardner, got out of his vehicle and started to pull security by a building. And about that time, a 122 millimeter mortar IED went off and killed him instantly. So that thought stuck in my mind, that image stuck in my mind. And what it's like, if you want to know what it's like to have that feeling, that despair, that shame, I want to read, it's a longer part, it's a longer story, but I really think you need to hear this to understand when people talk about PTSD, when they talk about moral injury, what it feels like and what it sounds like. The Fallen Heroes Project commissioned artist Michael Reagan to hand draw portraits of armed forces members who died during their service in Iraq and Afghanistan. The drawings were given to the family of the fallen at no cost. The sketch of Sergeant Freeman Gardner displays the face of a young African-American man in fashionable wire-framed glasses that are barely noticeable except for how they draw your attention to his eyes, nose, and ears. His eyebrows are perfectly arched around the top of the eyeglasses. Those features highlight Freeman's grin. His smile has the appearance that is a permanent expression, one that he carries regardless of his mood. The impression you immediately get is that he is much wiser than his age. Those who never met Freeman are left with disappointment that they will never have a conversation with him and learn what he was behind that grin. I was one of the fortunate people who had the pleasure to know him. The Fallen Heroes Project website was saved as a favorite on my computer at my office, where I'd started coming to work earlier and earlier. My sleep had become broken into intervals of hours and then minutes, until it became senseless to remain in bed and stare at the ceiling, even though I preferred that option to when my eyes did close and I would drift off into slumber. At work, I would click on the site and look at the sketch of Freeman. I'd force that image into my mind to replace the one of him lying on a gurney at Bob Liberty in Iraq, where the lips that made up his grin had turned purple, but the grin remained even in death. He looked as if he had been tucked to sleep with a wool blanket that covered him to his chest. The coarse linen concealed the trauma caused by the explosion of a 122 millimeter mortar that propelled shrapnel into his torso. However, the only visible sign of injury was a small cut above his perfectly arched eyebrow. My obsession with that seeming trivial abrasion possessed this particular dream. There were other apparitions that visited me in my sleep. The face of Joe Fenty was one. It was from a professionally done photograph taken when he was a battalion commander and still alive. The red stripes of the American flag behind him blended him with his red cheeks that appear sunburned. He looked as I remembered him after a trail race in upstate New York after we ran together on Virgil Mountain. Only then the brightness in his face was from running for 3 hours. There was also the woman on her knees pleading for us to help dig her daughters out from a building we had just destroyed. There were the bloodstains on the death chamber and bloated bodies. There was even the dead Iraqi truck driver from my first deployment to the Gulf with flies and gnats circling around his lifeless eyes. But what brought me out of sleep on most nights was the snap of a single bullet. It was not the crash of a barrage of gunshots as we experienced in firefights or even IED explosions. It was the sound of one solitary bullet that I actually heard in my mind that awakened me. There were at least 2 times I was engaged with one round from someone I assumed to be a sniper. Both instances I recall were in Mosul. The first round passed just by me, leaving no effect other than the noise it produced. The other round seemed to have been fired right next to me and slammed against the ammunition container of a 50 caliber machine gun. I'm not sure if the intended target was me or Sergeant Hudgens, who was in the hatch next to me. Nevertheless, it left a dent in the steel box that looked like it had been pounded by a sledgehammer. I'm not certain which of these instances it was that I dreamed about. There was never any imagery associated with the sound. It was just the snap that would bring me out of a dead sleep. One other vision had become more and more prevalent in my sleep, and that was of me putting a gun to my head. I never pulled the trigger, but the image of me placing a pistol to my temple and holding it there returned night after night. So, when you think about what manifests in us and what we call PTSD or moral injury, those things, those demons that torment us, more often than not, it's not the violence necessarily, but it's the loss. And sometimes how this manifests in veterans who have PTSD, me particularly, was with anger. An anger that I couldn't control, that I never saw coming until it burst out and made everyone numb around me to the point where they didn't care what I had to say or do. But there's a greater cost to war than just to the individual soldier. In fact, I will say that it is the least cost of war. It's to the families that we should be most concerned. And I want to read a story called Going. My daughter Madeline shook me out of a sleep. Daddy, wake up, Daddy. I sat up in a fog and said, what's up, honey? She spoke so fast I could barely understand her. He's dead, Bin Laden is dead, they killed him. I swung my feet to the side of the bed and stood up. She took my hand and dragged me to the television playing the news in the living room. We watched as the broadcast repeated that Osama bin Laden had been killed in Pakistan during a raid conducted by the United States. The significance of this began to soak in my mind as I reflected on our decade-long war, a war that started with a massacre masterminded by bin Laden. It was for that reason that I had spent 15 months in Iraq 3 years earlier. Before long, my wife Laura joined us in the living room and sat down next to us. I can't believe it, she says, but what does it mean? Madeline looked at her mother like she had lost her mind. She said, well, it means that Daddy doesn't have to go to Afghanistan. Right, Dad? My 13-year-old daughter hugged me tight at the neck, her cheek pressed against mine. She was close enough to feel the warmth of her breath. I just put my arm around her and stared at the TV. I curled my lips upward so it looked like I was smiling, but I didn't say anything. After a minute, Madeline slowly released me. She shifted on the sofa so she could look in my eyes. I always told her the eyes don't lie. I sensed her exhilaration shifting to something else. We looked at one another. Her enormous brown eyes began to swim in tears. Try as I might, mine did too. Persistent, she tugged at my shirt sleeve and said, but the war is over, Dad. We killed him. That means you don't have to deploy. The tears rounded below her eyes, then fell and ran down her cheeks. I still didn't say anything. You shouldn't have to go, she sobbed, breaking into tears. I kissed her cheek. As I did, I could taste the salt. When I spoke, all I could say was, I'm sorry, darling. 3 months later, my wife pulled the car to the curb of the Louisville airport, Madeline in the back seat. I stepped out, took my bags from the trunk, and put them on the curb. It's like pulling off a Band-Aid, I told them. I was ready then. I didn't cry. They didn't either. I turned back from the curb and they were waiting. We circled into a group hug. As I held them, I kissed them both and whispered, I love you so much. As we released, I said, before you know it, we'll be back for R&R and we'll be at Derby. I waved goodbye as they got in the car and drove away. Then I picked up my bags and walked into the airport. A man saw my uniform and approached me as I waited to check in. He wore a black cap adorned with rows of ribbons colored silver, purple, blue, and red. Above the bill were the words Vietnam Veteran, embroidered in gold along the top. Just getting back, he asked. In the intervening 3 years, I'd seen men and women like me, in uniforms like mine, with bags like mine, in airports all across the country. I always asked the same thing he did. Now I was one of the travelers in uniform again. I shook the old warrior's hand and smiled. "Going," I said. So, the families suffer, but the resilience of the American family and the people that support the warriors is really pretty remarkable. I remember when I was a battalion commander at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and we'd have graduation parades, and I would go down on the field to meet with the families afterwards, talk to them, see how the kids, tell them congratulations. Well, I'd seen this one family, his mother and a father and a young boy, and I walked up to him and I said, "Hey, congratulations, you must be very proud of your son." And the mother says, "I'm proud of all my boys. His brother is in Afghanistan right now. I wish his other brother was here to see him." And I said, "Well, where is he at?" She said, "Well, he died in Iraq 3 months ago." I went to her and I went to put my hand on her, and she said, "No, Colonel, that's all right. Now the nation has all my children. It's the least I can do." That courage, that kind of courage from that mother is the same courage that we ask of our American people to when that time comes, when something just doesn't seem right, those things that we learn from the World Affairs Council and being concerned citizens, that we figure out this is, what are we going to do about it? And then when our leaders say, "Hey, we're going to put those boots on the ground," we say, "No, it doesn't make sense," because we know the cost of war. And I'll also say that veterans who suffer from PTSD, who suffer from moral injury, need to demonstrate that same courage. We're not victims. We chose to do what we do. We volunteered for this business. That's what all volunteer force is about. So when that time comes and we start to recognize that we're starting to fall apart, we have to have the same courage to do the right thing for ourselves, but more importantly for our families, because if we don't, we will tear them apart and everything that we love apart with it. So I want to read a story, probably the proudest time that I've ever had, ever, whether in the military or not, and it's probably my favorite story. I got a call one Saturday morning from a fellow veteran I had met. He said he needed to talk. My friend had served in Afghanistan and took part in some very intense fighting in the mountains of Regional Command East. Ironically, his closest escape with death came on his combat outpost, with a partnered Afghan soldier opened fire with an automatic weapon on a group of coalition soldiers. My buddy gave first aid to the wounded in his proximity. Then he maneuvered to a flanked the Afghan, and then shot him dead, point blank. He received an award for valor for his actions. When he got out of the Army, he moved around and landed eventually in Louisville. He's working at a pub that I often frequented since I retired from the Army a couple months earlier. We'd met there along with another veteran who had served in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. We told stories, laughed, and reminisced with a fervor. One day over a Guinness, after a round of war stories, my friend took a sip and said, "We'll never be that cool again." I went to his apartment that Saturday after he called and knocked on the door. He opened it and asked me to come in. He looked very tired, disheveled. I sat in a chair and he sat on his couch. I had been to his apartment before. I scanned the room, noted a coffee cup full of snubbed cigarettes and a bowl of half-eaten cereal. I saw he had repositioned pictures of himself in Afghanistan and the Valorous Award citation he had received. They were normally on a stand in his office area of his two-room apartment. Now they were on the coffee table in front of them. I said, "What's up, brother?" He dropped his head. He shook it back and forth a couple of times as if he was having an argument with himself. He looked up and said, "The pros outweigh the cons." He then reached under the couch and pulled out a 9mm pistol. He held the weapon comfortably as if it were a part of him. He then lamented, I just don't want to deal with this shit anymore. Tell me why I shouldn't blow my brains out." I was not anticipating the question. However, I knew that I could not get the answer wrong. I bought myself time by saying, "You're bullshitting me, right?" He stared at me, didn't say a word, and waited for an answer. Strike one. I talked about his family and friends and all the people that loved him, how it wouldn't be fair to them. I felt him soften, but then he said, "They're better off without me. I'm just a fucking burden." Strike two. Then I looked at the pictures on the table. He was wearing multi-cam fatigues, full body armor, magazine holders filled, and a Mitch helmet, and he was cradling his M4 rifle. You could see the mountains in the background, the Hindu Kush, the foothills of the Himalayas. Having been there before and seen those photos, I recalled the sparse air at 8,000 feet, taking it full up into my lungs. I could remember looking out over the vast valleys and wondering if Alexander the Great had seen the same sights during his failed conquest of this harsh region. I took one of the pictures and I handed it to him. And I said, "Put the 9mm away, brother. We can be that cool again." He unloaded and cleared the weapon. He locked it in his arm safe and gave me the keys. We got in my car and drove around without a destination and did what soldiers do. We made a plan. So when we, as veterans, it is intuitive, instinctive to us to look out for our brothers in arms. What I would ask everyone here to do, and those that you speak about when you talk about this book, when you talk about these stories, to consider how you can help. I will tell you that this book began in Louisville with me looking out at the Louisville skyline from Jeffersonville, Indiana, thinking that I was, thinking about killing myself. This book also ends with Louisville. And in the last chapter, it says, and this is from the Fifth War, "Wars are not fought alone, even those, especially those that warriors wage at home within their own souls. When I was at my lowest, that point when I intended to drive my car into the Ohio River, there came together a confluence of guardian spirits, both in people and events, that connected like tributaries into a great waterway and eventually landed me safely on the shores of sanity." Those events, those people happened here in this city. I am alive because of the city, because of the therapists at our VA. We have one of the best VAs that I've ever seen. But the therapist who convinced me that I had the tools to overcome the challenges that I had, and who eventually said, "Fred, you need medication." Those therapists that I know here, that I met and learned from, helped save me. The people in this room helped save me. Jim Iacocca, Todd Sherman saved my life by having my back when I was at my lowest point, when I thought that there was nothing going to happen other than bad things for me. They shielded me and protected me and allowed me to, by that time, to take care of myself. I have other friends that I work with that have helped that as well. So the call to action here, and what I want to say is that you can help a veteran. Just take time to get to know us. Take time to understand the cost of war. Now, we're pretty decent people to get to know and go out and try to find them and have a conversation. So again, when those politicians say, "Let's put boots on the ground," you'll say, "Nah, dude, there's souls in those boots, and I know them." Thank you very much.
So, speaking of the city of Louisville, I'm going to bring up a good friend of Fred's for a special presentation that Fred doesn't know about.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Graham Shelby. I'll only take a moment, but I'm here in two capacities. One, as a friend of Fred's, and also in my capacity as an employee of Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher. The mayor believes very strongly in supporting our veterans, whether it's through programs that help veterans find jobs or that end veteran homelessness in our city. He also believes in the power of the arts to transform human lives, and he believes in innovation. And Fred embodies all of those through his work as a storyteller, through his work supporting other veterans, especially through innovative efforts like Shakespeare with Veterans. And Fred shows a lot of love for Louisville in this book and everywhere he goes. So those of us in the mayor's office felt it was only appropriate that Louisville show a little love back to Fred. And that's why I want to present, on behalf of Mayor Fisher, this official proclamation to Fred. It goes like this. To all whom these presents shall come, greetings. Know ye that the city of Louisville honors Fred Johnson for his courage, compassion, and conviction. As a U.S. Army veteran, an artist, and a citizen, Fred has dedicated himself to helping veterans and civilians better understand each other and to enriching the lives of those around him. Our city, Fred's adopted hometown, is grateful for his service to country and community, for the stories he tells, and for the love he's shown for Louisville. Fred, thank you so much.
So I would like to make one special recognition at the moment before we start with some questions. If Dr. Laura Eckler Johnson is around, please stand up, Laura. The sacrifice of families cannot be matched, as I think we all understand. A republic defended by few that are not understood by all cannot stand. It is our duty as citizens to understand the sacrifices, voluntarily or otherwise, of those who place themselves not only in harm's way, for ultimately we all risk our lives on a day-to-day basis, but we ask these young men and women to do something that, despite your negative or positive views of humanity, really isn't in our DNA. We ask them to take life, and we should never ask them to do that unless the cause is clear and understood and accepted by us all, so that when our warriors do come home, we can truly bring them back into our tribe. And hopefully, you've learned a little bit about that from Fred's book. And with that, we would love to take questions. I know Fred rather well. He is not a wallflower. I'm the introvert of the two. So please don't hold back. Any questions that you might have, fire away. Raise your hand high because the lights are glaring and it's difficult to see. Brian, if you would help us with questions. Oh, thank you.
Fred, I would love to hear your understanding of just war. What is a just war?
Gary, I knew you would ask a very hard question, and see, and what I can do is flip. See, Gary, in my book, I talk about, there's Gary, right? Gary, I talk in my book about a time that I ran 100 miles, actually I ran 108 miles. Everybody said, you're crazy. Well, see, there's that guy right there that convinced me to do it. So thank you for that question. Just war. I mean, there are volumes that, are written about it. I will tell you what I believe is just war based on my education and my belief in having fought just wars and wars that maybe were not so just. A war is just, in my mind, is when you have the will of the people behind it. That when the will of the people and that the people have skin in the game, literally and sometimes figuratively, but they have skin in the game, and that when that debate happens between our leaders and the people who are representing those who have to go into harm's way, and the people say, through the Republic and the representatives, yes, we need to go to war. This is something that we need to do. In my mind, in my heart, that is a just war. And there are wars being fought now that I believe are unjust because we have not had that dialogue. And the dialogue, and maybe that's not I'm not going to blame the politicians. I blame us. Why are we not going out and saying, I don't really understand why we're doing that. Can you explain it to us? Have that dialogue. So I believe when the will of our people are behind it, and I believe that is a just war. And Rob, you've actually studied this. Is there anything?
No, I would agree. We are a republic. We must hold ourselves accountable for decisions on when we go to war. Who here, and I'm not trying to separate the crowd, but who are the veterans in the crowd? If you've served in the Armed Forces of the United States, no applause please, that's not the purpose, but please just raise your hand. Half of the crowd. Where is the rest of the crowd? We need to be able to talk to the civilian population of the United States so that we all go to war together. We volunteered, yes, but do not send us and forget us. And the American public has done an incredible job of changing the wrongs that it had in the view of service members from the experience of our brothers and sisters during the war in Southeast Asia. But it's more than that. We succeed or fail as a country, as one people, regardless of any of the things that divide us normally, color, gender, geographic diversity. Unless we can go to war together, we shouldn't go.
Next question. What he said.
Yes, sir.
Fred, what words would you say to those in our community who have become fearful of all Muslims because of the Muslim-driven terrorist attacks in their perspective?
Thank you for that question. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about whenever I talked about, service with Islam. The way service with Muslims, rather, is it's like any person or people, regardless of the ethnicity, the gender, or the sexual orientation, or the race. It's having that conversation. I was very vocal and remain vocal about how Muslims are treated because I watched, I worked for General Karimi, who was the senior most general in the Afghan army. And regardless of where we were at, and it came time for prayer, salah, he would pray. When it came time, to do his rituals, he did that. And I found him to be a very pious man and a man of very sincere belief that the only way we could work together is by having a conversation. And I believe that's the way it is now. I was on the Moth not too long ago, and I told a story called, the first time I kissed a man. And the first time I kissed a man was in Afghanistan, and we were coming up. It was during Ramadan, and a buddy, we were approaching the guard nest. The buddy pulls out a soda and drank the soda, and the guard looks at me and looked like he wanted to kill me. And he had these like black eyes, like those eyes that had killed somebody and had seen death. And I said "Salaam alaikum." He didn't say anything back, and so over that time, I tried to learn the language. I tried to learn the culture, and. So eventually one day I came in and I say, "Assalamu alaikum, sobakai chituristi famil chituris," which is, good morning, how are you doing, how's your family? And he looked at me and he said, "Johnson, your Dari sucks." I said, "How'd you know my name, dude?" He says, "It's on your tag there, man, I can read it." And so, over time, we got to know each other. He worked on my Dari, we did times. And then one day during, he said, "Hey, Fred, I don't need you to come into work tomorrow." And I said, "Why? I got to come to work." He said, "No, you can't come into work." And next morning, I hear gunshots, explosions, and the Ministry of Defense had been attacked. And I finally got out and rushed over there, and Haratullah, his name was Haratullah, was good to go. And never did talk about why that happened. And I'd always noticed when we were having conversations with one another, and I'd see other Afghans when they greeted one another, they'd press cheeks and kiss one another. And I always wanted that kiss. And then finally on the last day before I was leave, I went to say goodbye to Haratullah, and he took his cheek and pressed it against mine. I pressed it against his. I felt his, I tasted his sweat, smelt it. And then he grabbed my hand and put his hand in between my fingers, and we walked like school children to the gate, and we said goodbye. Nobody said anything because that's what friends do in Afghanistan. And I believe that all of us should every now and then find a Haratullah to kiss. So that's what I think we need to do to better understand, not only Muslims, but everybody in our community. Have a conversation, be with them, and kiss a Haratullah.
One of the things that we can do is start learning geography a little better than we know it. to break down the Islamic world as a monolithic bloc is as ignorant as calling all Europeans a single bloc. There are multiple cultures and thoughts and interactions. The majority of Muslims don't live in what we know as the Middle East. We have to first understand what we don't understand before we can point fingers at any one direction. So we have to be more open, and we have to be more understanding. But that said, we also have to realize that while we cannot deny the Islamic world from our country, because I have gone to war with Islamic brothers on my wing, we must also not give sanctuary. Somewhere, and I don't mean that sanctuary city, so this is not a political message by any stretch of the imagination. But what it means is that we have to learn to actually have conversations that mean something and not give platitudes one way or the other. Should we ban Muslims from entering the United States? Absolutely not. Are we wrong for believing that an enemy will take advantage of any opportunity we give them if they are truly an enemy? Absolutely. So how do we have a rational conversation amongst ourselves that doesn't demonize or doesn't, acquiesce? Somewhere in between is what life's all about. Understanding the region, understanding the people, understanding the good in the people, understanding those that wish us well and those that wish us harm, and how we interact amongst ourselves is critical to that. There is no one side or the other in this.
This might be a difficult geopolitical question, but I'll still throw it out there.
Good luck.
If the U.S. did not maintain hegemony over the region, what do you think would happen to the Middle East? How would that affect the global economy?
Wow, man. That's a great question. I'll be honest with you, that's probably out of my scope, dude. I really don't, in terms of, this is what I believe, and I'll just, throw it out there regardless, and is that if we were not oil dependent, if we were not, we find alternate ways of creating energy, then we wouldn't need that area. That that we could find other ways to provide that energy, that we wouldn't be dependent on that oil, and that we'd be able to live our lives without that dependency. So, hegemony, I don't know if we have hegemony. I'm good on it, yeah. I don't know if we have hegemony in the Middle East, but I know one thing for sure: we need to find an alternate source of energy before we, so we can disengage from that part of the world.
I raise that question in response to the discussion about just war, because that my understanding of U.S. policy is we don't call it hegemony, but basically that's what I think we do in order to basically maintain the status quo as best we can. So I think the question of just war fits into that geopolitical question. Is that
How many people drive an SUV? I mean, kind of the point is, are we over-consuming? To me, if we want to, disengage, we find other ways to produce energy. I think that's out of my skill set, brother. I wish I could answer that. Maybe I'd run for president. Hey, Dave.
Being a macho guy myself, I've learned two things in my life. One, don't take any medicine, and don't listen to your wife. Have you any reflections on that?
Yes.
And especially in the context of trying to deal mentally with what you've had to deal with as a soldier.
Okay. Let me tell y'all a little bit about, that's David Yon right there. He's a friend of mine from Tallahassee, Florida. And when 9/11 had happened, we were living in Tallahassee. Laura was getting her PhD. We were having some challenges because I was working at different places and we were separated. And David and Mary Jean, his wife, came up and said, "What can we do to help you? We want to help you." And as long as I live, I will never forget that. And I will always love you and everything about you because of that. So, talking about my wife and medication, those things are almost synonymous, Because Because, I mean, the person that suffered more than anyone, with the exception of possibly Madeline, was my wife. She took the brunt of my anger. She took the brunt of my, the challenges that I faced. And she had told me long ago, when I first got back from Iraq, whenever she says, "You're not the same person that you were before." And I said, "What do you know? You just got a PhD in this shit, And so, finally it took a time when I got, whenever I was going to kill myself, I got in the car and I drove off, and a policeman, thank God, pulled me over and put me in jail. And when I got out of jail, I called Laura, and she didn't allow me to say anything. She says, "You're going to therapy, you're going on medication, or you're not going to have a wife and daughter." So those are both interconnected. And, Laura will say, "Hey, man, you really make me sound like I'm mean." I said, "Well, you kind of were mean, but I'm alive because of it, So, to answer your question, those two are connected. And I'm not ashamed. People say, "You're on medication." Yeah, I'm not ashamed. A diabetic has to take insulin. I've got some things that I deal with, and I take medication, and I have therapists and psychiatrists that have made the mixology to the point where, I just don't get angry anymore. Really, not that often, but, I get mad when the Cardinals lose, but, so, that's kind of where that's from.
4 times a day, too.
Huh? Right. Yeah, one more question. Amy, did you have a question? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Fred, tell us what different stories make. What difference they make in your life.
Stories. I just recently started calling myself a storyteller. But I think we're all storytellers, because that brings the richness and purpose into our lives. Because, it's the story. I mean, that's one of the oldest forms of art is storytelling. So what I've learned is, in one of this organization we helped put together with Kentucky Shakespeare's, we use Shakespeare to tell stories. And that helps the veterans that we work with work through issues, because there's no one that speaks greater to the heart of a warrior than William Shakespeare. So stories are very important in our lives, are very important to me. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir. Hey, Jeff.
Do you plan to write another book?
Yes, I do. In fact, I'm starting to put it out. Yeah. Yeah, I'm starting. It's funny. I think that was a plan, because it's about my hometown in Centralia, Illinois, and it's about growing up in a bar. Those of you that may know me, I literally grew up in a bar, and so there's no greater lessons learned about life and everything else than having a drunk tell you about his problems. So I learned a lot. I learned how to listen. I think Laura would disagree maybe, but there's a lot of things that came out of that. So I'm working on something about our hometown. You guys want to know about Shakespeare?
Yeah.
Okay, let's show them. Come on, guys.